Okay, so hello, comrades. Today we are talking again with Professor Bruno, and our meeting will be focused on Władysław Gomułka. So the point of the today is to answer the question whether Władysław Gomułka was a communist and what should be the attitude of the communist movement towards this personality and what he represents. The pretext to talk about Gomułka is the approaching 50th anniversary of the events on the Baltic coast when the army was firing at workers on strike. It was during the time that Gomułka career really ended. So let's start with the events on December 1970. Tell our foreign viewers what happened next. And please tell us your opinion during these events. Should communists support workers or rather the government of the Polish Republic of Polish People Republic?
Yes, so theoretically about Gomułka, was he a communist or not? I would say subjectively, for sure, he was a communist. That what we can see at the closed reunion of the Warsaw Pact chief of state in 1968, before the Soviet army intervention in Czechoslovakia, and then he made a speech to other communist leader. And he was supported, especially by Walter Ulbricht from the GDR, showing that the Czechoslovak party direction is going to the anti-Marxist-Leninist line, and Marxist-Leninist line should be defended. And this is, of course, a closed reunion, so it's not a public reunion, and it is quite important to see how Gomułka was seeing what is Marxism-Leninism and how he will defend it. But that's, of course, subjectively. We can have other opinion objectively, but anyway, subjectively, that's for sure. Gomułka thought about himself as a Marxist-Leninist, so as a communist. And now to the Baltic Sea coast riots, and the situation is very complicated, because what happened there is up to today not very clear, since no real inquiring commission was built after the departure of Gomułka and when Gierek arrived to power. No historical commission was created after Gierek was ousted from the party leadership in the 80s, and no historical commission was created after the 89 political transformation toward capitalism. So what it means? It means that there seems that there is something unclear with those Baltic coast events. What is sure anyway? It is that the political bureau, and especially Gomułka, did send an order when the events began, telling that the army can shoot if public buildings are attacked and burned. The army can shoot to the air. Then it can shoot. If it doesn't work, it can shoot to the legs. But it is forbidden to shoot to kill. This order is. And what...
Yes, Bruno, but could you explain what happened, why it was this riot? Because
of course. The riot was because it was just before the holiday, the Christmas holiday, and the prices of meat were going up, and this provoked the riots. What can be explained? Why the people were unhappy, were against this change? That looks like a provocation on one side, and on the other side, people we can understand hypothesis. We can have the hypothesis why Gomułka took this decision. It is for sure that this decision was taken before Christmas, and it's not sure if Gomułka realized that it was not the good moment to take that decision. And anyway, this decision was the result of a long reflection at the political bureau about the change of prices, giving lower prices to industrial products and higher prices to food products. So the question that the decision was taken just before Christmas holidays is, of course, can look very stupid. And some people say it was a provocation against Gomułka because it was very well known that Poles are buying a lot of meat in front of holidays, and that was the worst moment to carry on. On the other side, other people say Gomułka did take this decision because he was very happy with the fact that 2 weeks earlier, Poland has signed with Western Germany the treaty recognizing the Western Polish borders, and that the Polish nation will be so happy because of that, of the success of Polish diplomacy, that they will accept the price, the change of price of meat. That's two hypotheses. Anyway, what is sure, it's that a lot of workers were very deceived and unhappy with that decision, and they decided in Gdańsk, in Gdynia, and in Szczecin to take the street and begin a manifestation against those decisions without having any organization. And it's all obvious, it's the history of the working movement is showing that if you begin to take the street without any organization, it's very difficult then to control the events. And that's what happened, because when the manifestation arrived in front of state and party building, people began to attack these buildings and burn them. And it's up to today, it's very difficult to know if it was workers or if it was some kind of provocateurs that did that. But anyway, it was that situation. And in this situation, the order, as I told you, were not to kill, just to react, to make people afraid and push back from the burned buildings. And it was very hard situation, because in that time they had to send helicopters in the roof of the building to save the administration out of the building. But anyway, that's the first problem, is that why the order coming from Warsaw was not realized. And it's not only a case in one city, it was the case in 3 cities. So in Gdańsk, Gdynia, and Szczecin. So the situation looks like if it was a coordinated order to not respect the order from Warsaw. That's the first thing. The second thing, we had in Gdańsk 2 directions and not 1 direction, because on one side we had the local party secretary, which was telling to the worker to come back to the factory and work, and we had Zenon Kliszko from the political bureau having another team in Gdańsk telling workers not to go back to work, that the factories will be closed. And because of that, we had the second event of killing, because when the workers looked at the TV, the local first secretary of the party telling them to go back to work, they went back to work. And when they went back to work, the soldier fired at them, because they were listening to the order of Zenon Kliszko, who was telling them that the factory are closed and people cannot go in. So there is a contradiction of 2 powers during those days, and it is a question that has not been solved up today. Who is responsible for that situation of two power having contradictory policies toward the riots and the rioters? And the main question is, was this situation a provocation against Gomułka to put Gierek on power, or was it just a question of anarchy and not well organized power and something like a bureaucratic disintegration of the leading apparatus of the country? And it is important because then we can look at the events on the Baltic coast as a military coup against Gomułka, or we can look at them just as the end of the degeneration, let's say, of the existing Gomułka leadership in the country. And the question is that this question has not been solved up to today. It means that the three later direction of the country, the socialist one, the Gierek one, and the Jaruzelski one, but also the capitalist one, didn't wanted to know the truth, because we have still a lot of elements unknown up to now. Who is responsible of the decision to shoot and kill? And why there were two directions to lead the repressive policy, and not one direction, which is a situation that seems unclear. So after 1970, we had the legend of the workers' protest, which is true in the sense. It's of course true that the working class protested against the decision. But after that protest, we have to ask who used that protest for political change, or was it only a spontaneous rebellion in front of a decaying political direction that was not able to control the situation? And up till now, we have no real answer. We have part answer, but we have no real answer. And what is important is that nobody in the direction of Poland, of socialist Poland or capitalist Poland post Gomułka, wanted really to create an inquiry commission that could really fix who is responsible of what happened on the Baltic coast. Up till now, it is what in Polish we call biała plama. It means white shirt, not written history. So we have still a question we have to ask, since the 1970 events, where the legitimacy foundation not only for the Gierek era, but mostly for the Solidarność movement in 1980s, because the first one of the first thing the worker asked during the August 1980 strike was to build a monument for the workers of the 1970 events. The monument was built, but still the question who is behind the firing of workers is still open.
Okay, but could you explain me why workers are burning the committee of the Party of Workers?
Because of course that's another question. That's a much bigger issue, and for the, let's say, for the legitimacy the anti-communist transformation, the 1970 events are linked to the 1956 events in Poznań. They say it's from the very beginning, the Workers' Party of Poland was an anti-workers party, was supposed to talk in the name of workers, but of course the socialism is against working class, and so on and so on and so on. So for them, this is the explanation that the Polish United Workers' Party was objectively in their mind against working class from the very beginning, not from 1970, but from the very beginning. For the actual propaganda in Poland, the communists were just Russian agents taking the country under foreign occupation and working against their own nation. Of course, it's a caricatural point of view, but I mention it because it's the basis of the events of 1970. And that's what we have to think about. What happened really in 1970 and why there were contradictions between working class and the leadership of the working class, of the working party. And on this side, we have to understand that in 1970, we had a strong disintegration of the party, which was led by, in fact, three competing group. The group of Gomułka, which was carrying on something I would define as what, let's say, national communism. Of course, we have to discuss about this concept, but more or less a supposed communism for Poland as an objective that can only be reached with national roots. And we had
Polish way to communism, Polish way to socialism, Polish way to socialism.
Yeah. That's it. That's it. So that's why I defined it as national communism. We had a much harder line on that direction with Moczar, which was the Ministry of Interior, which was not only a national communist, but I would say a pure nationalist. I mean, he was using anyway nationalist argumentation. And on the other side, we had the Gierek fraction, which I would, of course, at that time he would not say that, but I would describe it as the social democrat orientation in the party. And what I'm telling is not only my own opinion, it's the Gierek's opinion, because after the transformation of the regime in 1980s, before he died, he made an interview in the press, Polish press, and he told, basically, I am a social democrat. I was in the Communist Party only because I had to immigrate to France. And in France, the only party that accepted foreigners in the left was the Communist Party, because the socialists were nationalists and racist, and they didn't accept foreign workers. So I became communist in France because I had no chance to be socialist. But basically, if I would have been in Poland at that time, I would have been a member of PPS, of the Socialist Party, and not a member of the KPP, of the Communist Party. So when I say that Gierek was a social democrat, I mean, I just tell what he told 20 years later. But basically, when you observe his policy on the top of the regime, but also locally, because he was the regional secretary of the Upper Silesia region, it was a typical social democrat policy of redistribution of wealth, not taking into account the general interest of the whole country, but to make out of his region something like a fortress of well-being and welfare state. And it looked like social democratic economical policy, and it was social democratic also in the way that it was absolutely non-ideological base. We can talk whatever we want about Gomułka or even Moczar, but Gomułka and Moczar were quoting Karl Marx, Lenin. We can discuss if they were doing that good in a good way or in a bad way. But Gierek never used any ideological argumentation before he went to power and after he went to power. It was his credential to show to the Pole he was pragmatical. He was not an ideological leader, and he was taking into his attention was concentrated of the well-being of the people, and no importance toward ideological questions. What led also to the basic question, not of the depth, because Gomułka during the 60s, he always fought against the idea to Poland to be indebted. He didn't want to have loan from Western countries, even if he was conscious that Poland had not enough capital to build very quickly socialism. So, but in spite of that, he was always telling we cannot accept loans because capitalism is going to have crisis, and when there will be a crisis of capitalism, we will, if we have debt, then we will have to pay for them, and we will not be able to pay for that. So it will be the end of socialism. And in the 70s, when he was not in power, when he was just a normal citizen, he sent quite a lot of letters to the Central Committee telling that the policy taken by Gierek of putting Poland with loans will be very dangerous in the future for socialism. But Gierek was, as I told you, pragmatical, and he was telling that Marxists thought that the capitalism will have crisis, but after 30 years of experience in the Western world, we see that this point of view is an old one that is not linked with the reality of capitalism. So now we can take a loan from Western banks and Western governments because capitalism has changed and it's a very developed economy. And if we take money from West to invest and create a good industrial basis for Poland, Poland will be a rich and developed country, and we have to resign from old Marxist point of view, which are not actual and do not correspond to the reality. And that's the basic question we had in the 70s between Gomułka and Gierek. And of course that the workers on the Baltic coast were not aware of this situation and could not be aware of this situation. And if we will have to criticize Gomułka, I think that the main critic we can have against him is the fact that he didn't manage to create a new working class aware of the world contradiction. Because we have also to notice one fact, which is basic. It's that the new working class took the streets. The Gdańsk, the Szczecin working class, it was a class that was created under socialism from peasant background. And it is very important to notice that in 70s and later, the old working class area of Poland, it means the area of Poland where we had an old working class from the pre-war period, it means an old working class knowing what was capitalism. I'm talking about Dąbrowa Górnicza, I'm talking about Silesia, I'm talking about Łódź. Mostly these three, let's say, old Polish working class fortress of the pre-war period, they never took the street in 1970, in 1980, and they didn't vote for the, let's say, unsocialist or even anti-socialist opposition.
Wait. In 1970, there was a history of the Gierek came to Łódź to the farm who was protesting.
In 1971, after the strike, yes, he went there. There was a strike in Łódź, but there was no. The woman didn't took the street. I mean, they were protesting, but they were protesting on the old working class tradition. It means not taking the street if you have no organization to control the manifestation. And it's important to notice that, because we see that the old working class, the traditional, let's say, pre-war working class, it was workers that had parents who were workers. So even, of course, if under socialism they didn't have any more contact with capitalism, they still had in the memory the fact that capitalism is a danger for the working class. But if we go to Gdańsk, Szczecin, and Gdynia, or other centers of Poland, then we have peasants with the petit bourgeois mentality of peasants, and they didn't know capitalism. They went directly, I would say, from feudalism to socialism. And that's the main error made by Gomułka. But in other socialist country, we can have also the same situation. It is that the situation that they didn't manage to educate politically the new working class about what is class struggle, and that class struggle is not only a question limited to one country, but it's an international question, and that the Western capital is not wanting to make Poles happy, but is wanting to conquer Poland, to make out of Poles new slaves. And this propaganda was never carried on. The party apparatus under Gomułka was, I would say, theologically Marxist, of course, quote, theologically Marxist, but there was no real political education of the masses. And that's more, from my point of view, the main error Gomułka did. So when you ask the question, was he a communist or not? I would answer as I began. He thought of himself as a Marxist-Leninist, of course, but in the same time, he didn't take the tools to make people Marxist-Leninist. He tolerated the church, he tolerated a lot of situation where Poles were not asked to understand was it Marxism, at the condition they accept the general direction of the country. And that's what I would define as something like a post-feudal socialism. It means we have a good king in Warsaw, taking the interest of the people. We have not to think about politics, and that's the reality of the Gomułka era. It's something like a paternalistic socialism, and not a strong ideological socialism. Of course, it can be, it needs to be discussed. I mean, that's my opinion. But of course, I can understand people do not agree with me on one side or the other. But I would say that it was something like an opportunistic socialism. It was still a socialism, but opportunistic socialism, and it led to the pragmatic social democrat socialism of Gierek era, when the doors, let's say, to the Western capital were open, and after the Western capital, then logically we had the capitalism in Poland. That's my point of view.
Okay, Bruno, because I have a lot of questions about Gomułka, but I think that I'm sorry that I all the time I'm asking about these events on the Baltic coast. I think that we can continue. We have 1 hour and 1 hour or 15 minutes, and this question, which I prepared, I will ask next week. So I will continue. I have another 2 questions about this Baltic Coast event. First, do we have proof that there was inspiration of the Western countries to this?
No, we have not. What we can say, and it's my personal testimony, because I was in 1969, so 1 year in front of the events in the Baltic coast. I was very young, but still I was already interested in politics. And with my parents, we went, my father, he's Polish, he had an old friend from the pre-war period who was working at Radio Free Europe in Munich. So we were traveling to Poland, and we went through Munich and then later to Poland. And my father had discussion with this friend. She was working for the American-funded Free Europe. And we had a political discussion. I remember that she told in 1969, in the Polish party direction, we have a man we very, very support. It's Gierek. If Gierek took the power in Poland, that is very good. Of course, very good from the Western point of view. So I think that if in Radio Free Europe in 1969 they were looking positively at Gierek, it doesn't mean, of course, that Gierek was an agent of the CIA, a formal agent of the CIA. But anyway, it means that his way of looking at things was considered by CIA, because Radio Free Europe is CIA. We have to be conscious of that. That the Gierek line is the line that is positive for their interest. For the interest of USA, not the interest of Polish working class, of course, and they were also, and they were very convinced that the 2 other fractions we had at the Polish Polish United Workers Party, it means the Gomułka fraction and the Moczar fraction, for different reasons, were, from their point of view, very negative and had to be eliminated. So this is, of course, a personal testimony. That's not. I cannot tell that the CIA was present in Poland and organized this or that, but it means that the establishment of the US imperialism was observing what was happening in Poland, and they chose their best candidate, who was Gierek, and they were convinced that Gomułka was negative of their point of view, especially because in 1978 he played a great role in the decision of the Warsaw Pact treaty to intervene in Czechoslovakia. The documents we have are for sure clear that the two most radical, let's say, in the decision to intervene in Czechoslovakia was Gomułka and Ulbricht, who were much more decided to intervene in Czechoslovakia than Brezhnev. Brezhnev was hesitating at time. Gomułka and Ulbricht were tough line. We have to stop what's happening in Czechoslovakia. So of course you can understand that Radio Free Europe and CIA and United States and imperialism looked at Gomułka as their worst enemy within the Warsaw Pact Treaty states. Of course, it has changed in 1956. Their point of view was very different. But now we are in 1970. So I don't think that the CIA had to really create turmoil in Poland in 1970, because inside the United Workers' Party, you had a fraction that was decided to open, like, quote, to open Poland to Western diplomacy and to Western capital. Mostly to Western capitals. So if there is a provocation, I think that it was entirely sufficient that this provocation was coming from the interior of the state and party apparatus in Poland.
Okay, and other question about this event: are there the strikes, the demonstration in other cities than Szczecin, Gdynia, and
1970? No, you had in Elbląg. You had also something in Elbląg, but only in those cities. The rest of the country didn't took the street and even strike. The strike you are talking about, which is a bit later. And that's important. I think that the Baltic coast, there were different reasons for the Baltic coast, why it was concentrated on the Baltic coast. It was concentrated on the Baltic coast because first, as I told earlier, it was a new working class without any class culture. The typical example of this new working class is Lech Wałęsa. He is a peasant from, I guess, from Mazovia or from central Poland that arrived who arrived in Gdańsk and became their workers. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it was port city, port sea cities, and there was a lot of contacts. Much more contact with Western world, but especially a black market with Western countries. You had a lot of gangs, let's say, not criminal ones in radically speaking, but you had criminal gangs that were stealing different goods in ships and selling them to the country from Gdańsk and Szczecin. So you had a corrupt local group, more or less linked sometimes with the local party apparatus, because of course it was a port town. And the third element, and that's I think very important, is Baltic coast has, of course, which is obvious for geographical reason, special links with Scandinavia, Sweden, especially with Sweden. And it was the time, if you remember, that the so-called Swedish socialism was something like a model of middle of the way road, not real tough capitalism, but not real tough communism. It was the era of, Olof Palme, Sweden, as the temple of democracy, liberty, and socialism. And of course, from the Polish point of view, the situation of Sweden was something like looking like a miracle, because you could think, oh, the Swedes, they have all the best from the West, and they have all the best from the East. They have the social security, the social insurance, the social stability, the social equality from the East, and they have the liberty, the consumer goods from the West. Of course, this is an illusion, and history showed it, because now we have Sweden, Sweden now has one of the most reactionary law against working class in EU, in European Union. Nobody will tell you that, but in fact, Sweden is one of the most reactionary state in the EU concerning employment and labor laws. So, I mean, the mirage of the Swedish socialism definitely vanished for the ones who want to see it. Of course, you have still people thinking Sweden is a social democratic paradise, but in fact, it's a tough capitalist hell. But that's that we know now. Of course, in 1970, Sweden was something like a miracle, and especially in the Baltic coast city. So there is something like a link between what I told you, the social democrat way of thinking of Gierek, whose fortress was in southern Poland, in Silesia, and the Swedish socialism miracle of the north city of Poland. And I also personally experimented that, because in the 70s, when I was studying in Krakow, I had the opportunity because I had one friend of mine was the teacher of the Swedish language at the Krakow University, and she asked me. We talked, and she told me, "What are you doing in the holidays in summer?" And I told her, "I would like to work somewhere, and to make money in the summer." And she told me, "I have a factory in Sweden where you can have work there." And so I went there to Sweden as a working class, I was a worker in the toilet paper factory near Gothenburg, and there was a lot of Polish workers there from Gdańsk, or Polish seamen from Gdańsk also, who were working in the summer in Sweden and then going back to Poland and working for ships or shipyards in Gdańsk. And I had then a lot of discussion with them, and I realized how many were completely sure that Sweden was the paradise, that Swedish socialism was the best, that Poland has just to go the way Sweden, and then we will have the paradise. We would not have all what was bad in Eastern socialism, in Soviet-style socialism, but we would not have the hardliner neoliberal capitalism. It was this mirage was working really hard. My experience is in the 70s, but it was prepared already from the 60s. And according to me, it explains why the Baltic coast was so important in 1970, and later was also the base of Solidarność in 1980, because this Swedish mirage was working very well. Actually, and was much more appealing than let's say capitalist Britain or United States at that time, and it worked. It worked.
It is very interesting what did you say, because in Polish anti-communist propaganda there exists a myth that the borders of Poland were closed.
They were not closed. Of course, they were not completely open, but they were not closed. It was possible to go in the 60s out of Poland, and in the 70s. The official statistic gives that 1 million Poles every year went to the Western countries, and especially to Sweden, Finland, and Austria, because these three countries were the only Western country without visa for Poles. So when a Pole had a passport, he could go travel to Sweden freely. He had not to ask for visa. Visa were difficult to obtain in France, in United States, in Britain. But for Sweden, you had just to take the ship in zlotys. You paid in zlotys, not in dollars, so it was possible for a Pole. The Pole who had passport could go freely to Sweden, and of course, especially seamen, because seamen had passport. Of course, I mean, seamen have passport because they travel all over the world. So any Polish seaman had passport, and in the summer he took holidays on the Polish side and went to Sweden, and where was taken by working by factories to work 2-3 months in Swedish factories, because it was holiday time and they were looking for a working force. So they received Swedish salary, and then they went back to Poland, and on the black market they changed the Swedish crowns in zlotys, and they were, they were very rich, because the black market change was so good that a worker having Swedish crowns in Sweden, he would not be very rich. But with Swedish crowns in Gdańsk, he was able to build a house, very big house, and he was rich, and so on. So there is something like a demoralization of the working class in the Baltic Sea that happened, especially through seamen going to Sweden, to Finland, but especially to Sweden for working in the 70s. So of course the legend that Poland was a closed country is a legend. Of course, you had to have passport, and you could have your passport refused. But basically, as I told you, 1 million Poles every year in the 70s was officially traveling in Western countries. Of course, in the same time, you had 10 million Poles traveling in socialist countries, because Poles were massively going in holidays to the Bulgarian coast, for example. So 10 million in the east and 1 million in the west, but 1 million still, it's a very big part of the Polish population that was traveling, and mostly they were not traveling as tourists, they were traveling as workers, and especially to Sweden, which was the real destination of especially Baltic coast workers and seamen.
Okay, one more time, I want to ask how it is possible that without organization, without leader, in 3 or 4 cities, we have big workers' demonstrations, because I try to build the workers' party. I try to make a demonstration like this, but 20 years of my efforts don't work, and I can't imagine how it is possible that in a very short period, without organization, we have, I think, that the biggest class struggle in the 20th century on Poland, or one of the biggest.
Yes, but I mean, especially in Poland, you have organization from 1970. Up to 1970, of course, there was in Poland a relatively small group of intellectuals, basically intellectuals, psychologically, intellectually, and financially linked with Western powers. The symbol of that is Bronisław Geremek, who is for sure in the 60s the most visible, and I would say the most wealthy intellectual linked with West. But what changed after 1970 is that the dissidents, the opposition, began little by little to conquer something like a base within the working class. And of course, they were helped by, especially by IFL-CIO, it means by the United States trade unions, which we know are very linked with the United States establishment, political establishment, conservative establishment, capitalist establishment. But still, if we look at the testimonies of people from the opposition in the 70s, they say that the opposition in, let's say, in the middle of the 70s was maybe in all Poland something like 1,000, 2,000 people, no more. But these people were occupying strategical places in Warsaw or in Gdańsk. And when the strike began at the end of 80s, they were able to take the control of the working movement, of the working strike, because the Polish working class, the new Polish working class I told you about, was completely ideologically unaware of the world situation, or when they were aware of the world situation, they were looking for the Swedish miracle. I remember I had in Sweden, in the factory I told you about, I had a discussion with a Polish worker, which was also a seaman. And he was telling me things like about the Swedish socialism as a pure paradise, and that we should have that in Poland because it shows that we can have socialism without poverty, and so on and so on. And in the same time, he told me, my ship was going to Vietnam, and I was scandalized when I saw Vietnam because our Polish tractors were given to the Vietnamese for free, and we don't think about our own nation, and we help Vietnamese. And I told him, Poland is helping Vietnamese because Vietnamese are aggressed by USA, and it's the interest of Polish working class to have a socialist Vietnam. And he said, I don't care about Vietnamese, I just care about Polish workers. I'm much nearer from Western workers than I'm with Vietnamese yellow people, and so on. It was almost racist what he was telling, but it was the ideology he had. I mean, concretely, he couldn't understand that the fight of Vietnamese people was the fight for his own working class. He was sure that workers of Sweden were okay, but peasants from Vietnam, it was not our business. And he couldn't understand that there is something like humanity, like humankind, you have first to be a human being, and then you can be a Pole. But he was first Pole, and then, well, yes, let's talk about humankind, but mostly white one.
But all this thing which you said about Sweden, for me, it's not logic, because Sweden is for me a country social democratic. Social democratic, they don't want to confrontation. They want to discussion. They want to search the consensus. The example of the workers of the Baltic coast, they don't want to talk. They wanted to fire the Workers' Party committee. It is not tradition of the Sweden.
Yes, of course, you're right. But what I experienced then, it was that they were on this factory. They were looking at the Swedish trade unions as an example. Look, they have trade unions which are discussing with the leading direction on the partnership. In Poland, they don't give a shit about working class. You have the party apparatus in the director in the shipyard, and they don't care about workers. They are a group completely corrupt, which is partly possible. I mean, the working party apparatus was to a certain extent corrupt, and especially, I think, it was especially corrupt in the Baltic Sea because of all of this black market I told you about, and that's one of the error that was made by Gomułka for sure. The first one I told you about was the ideological question. The second one was that there was no real consequent anti-corruption campaign that would have asked working people to denounce the corrupted people inside the state or party apparatus. There was something. The Gomułka era is an era where the leading party under Gomułka was convinced that he has not the support of the majority of the nation. And to have this support, you have to accept a lot of things which are not good from the Marxist point of view, but you have to accept them because church is so strong, you cannot fight it so strongly, because national tradition are anti-Russian, and you have to take into account the fact that Poland don't like Soviet Union, because black market is something bad, but in a certain way it makes people able to buy things you cannot find in the shops, but you don't explain them why you cannot find them in the shops, and you don't explain that Sweden has no world war, was not destroyed, and is richer because of that, because Sweden did make benefit out of war when Poland was destroyed during that war. But you have to explain people that Poland cannot have the economical level of Sweden in 1960 because Poland is going from a third world situation to a developed country situation. Sweden is already a developed country, so of course it's richer. And all that has to be explained. And it was explained in the Polish medias, but in a very passive way of explaining things. There was no political ideological offensive in Poland to really make people aware that Poland is not Sweden, and that the Swedish socialism is to a certain extent hypocritical, because it's only an appearance of working class co-gestion, as they were, but it's not a real socialist power, because of course in Sweden I saw that, of course, the owner of the factory I was working in, he was going among workers, he was chatting with them, he was looking at a very fine guy, etc. And he was talking with trade unions, like if they were good friends and so on. And of course, the look of social democratic capitalism made the impression that the social relation in Sweden were better than in Poland, where that's a fact. When I tell post-feudal socialism, to a certain extent, it's true, because a lot of, let's say, apparatus bureaucrats were arrogant. I mean, I guess everybody who lived in Poland and that years know that local party leaders were very often behaving like a little feudal king. They were not really communist. They were just taking the party card to go up, and they were still thinking, because they were from peasant origin, their ambition was not to be the vanguard of peasants and workers. Their ambition was to be the feudal that came from the peasantry, but thinking, now I will be the good king, or the good landlord, or the good one, but still with a hierarchy. And because that's the basic problem of Polish, not only Polish, but especially Polish socialism, that it was not a revolution made from the bottom; it was coming from up, and it was. And they recruited a lot of people from the lower classes, but mostly peasants who had a very strong petit bourgeois mentality. And also this explains why Gomułka decided we cannot force collectivization. We have to introduce collectivization step by step, because Polish nation is not prepared to collectivization. We have to respect that situation and to put it very, very slowly. But it was so slowly introduced that at the end it was never introduced. And that's moim zdaniem. That's to my point of view. That's the main error, coming not only from Gomułka as a person, but from the Gomułka elite and the Gomułka apparatus, which was post-peasant, post-feudal leadership, and not a real working class leadership. Since, of course, there was not a lot of workers in Poland in 1945. I mean, already before the war, Polish was not an industrial nation, except for some islands. And of course, these factories were most of the time destroyed, and the working class dispersed in the country. So in 1945, you had very, very few places where you had the working class. So you had to create a worker state on the base of peasants. But peasant in Poland, the peasant culture was mostly the culture of what we call in Poland ruch ludowy. It means the culture of petit bourgeois, little owners, and People's Poland, to a large extent, was that, especially that the new working class. This is also another point I didn't talk about, but the new working class, the one you have in the Baltic coast, but also the one you have in other center of Poland, was half workers, half peasants, because most of the time they had still in the countryside a little field. And they were petit bourgeois capitalists when they were producing potatoes. And in the same time, they were working in the factory. So their mind was not really proletarian. It was something like a mix between worker and peasant petit bourgeois. So it's not only Gomułka, it's all the country that was like that. But of course, Gomułka was the leader of that situation, and he was let's quote, realistically looking at that, because he thought you cannot force Poles to go so quickly as we would like towards socialism. And in the other side, there was also something that was helping that, is the anti-Russian feeling. That Gomułka was aware of, and he was telling, if I collectivize, for example, too much, they will tell me I'm a Russian agent. So I must look for Poles as a Polish patriot. And a Polish patriot cannot do in Poland what they did in Soviet Union. So Soviet Union is good in the propaganda at the Gomułka time, Soviet Union is good because it defends our Western borders against Germany, against German imperialism, but it's not a good example for internal policy. So it was something in the middle of the road. It was partly pro-Soviet and partly nationalistic towards Soviet Union. And this is a compromise that couldn't be very long, because at a certain moment you have to choose. The problem of People's Poland is that the choice was done on the right side and not on the left side, and this choice was basically done in 1970.
Yes, but I think that this situation about peasant in Poland, it's not typical for Poland. It is typical for all Eastern Europe countries which are not industrialized before the Second World War, but the politic of the other communists in other countries. I am not specialist, but I think that in Bulgaria or Romania or in Yugoslavia, maybe they had situation similar in the population of the peasants, but because of the more socialist politic of the leaders of the parties, they marched towards the socialism and they collectivized this.
Yeah, but you have a very big difference. A peasant movement in Hungary, in Romania, in Bulgaria were with their, let's say, fascist government during the Second World War. So after the Second World War, the peasant parties were delegitimated. So the communists could very easily tell peasant movement, you were on the side of the fascists, so shut up. In Poland, whatever you think about Ruch Ludowy, about Ludowcy, about the peasant movement, you cannot tell them they were not on the side of the resistance against the Nazi occupier. So it's the same thing with the church. The Hungarian church or the Croatian church could have been destroyed because they were the collaborators of the Nazi fascist regime. But the Polish church, whatever we think about the reactionary character of the Polish church, you cannot tell that Polish priests were collaborators with the Nazi. Most often they were on the side of the nation, of the resistance. So after the war, it was very difficult in Poland to tell church or peasant leaders they are traitors, because they were not traitors. So they had a legitimacy inside the society. Of course, at the Bierut time, they wanted to let's say, destroy that, more or less. And at the Gomułka time, we had the situation, they say, no, we must accept that the Ludowcy, the peasant movement and the church were on the patriotical side. They are not traitors. We have to find some compromise with them because they are patriots just as we are patriots. And the same thing for the anti-Soviet feelings. Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary were allied with Hitler. So when in 1945 you were anti-Soviet, it was very easy and very often very objective to accuse an anti-Soviet discourse in Hungary of being just Hitlerist, Nazi, fascist. In Poland, you couldn't tell that because a lot of anti-Soviet parties were also fighting against German occupant. So you couldn't tell them they are traitors. And even Stalin was very aware of that. And that's one of the reasons he never accepted that Gomułka would have a trial. Because in Poland, Berman and Bierut, they they thought maybe we will do a trial of Gomułka. But Stalin defended Gomułka because he said, now he's in prison, in jail, but maybe he will be useful if there is something in Poland not happening on the wrong side, because we know he's not pro-Western. We know he's a patriot. And we know that he's maybe a nationalist, right-wing communist, but still he is not on the side of Western world. And Gomułka was not pro-West. It was the best proof is the 1968 activity of Gomułka during the Czechoslovak crisis. I mean, it shows Gomułka was really on Eastern-oriented. Was he a good communist? It's another question. But anyway, it's sure that Gomułka was Eastern-oriented and not Western-oriented. So there is a lot of ambiguity with Gomułka. And I think that your first question, was Gomułka a communist or not, is very difficult to answer, because it's a question, what is more important, tactical or strategy? Strategically, Gomułka was communist. But the problem is that tactically, he was using tools that can be described as non-communist. I would not say anti-communist, but non-communist. And sometimes the question is the balance between tactic and strategy. Because when the tactic becomes more important than the strategy, then objectively it's not real communism. And in the case of Gomułka and Gomułka leadership, that's the main problem. What was the proportion of tactic and strategy in the Gomułka era? And the answer is not very, very, very clear. I mean, it's a question that have to be debated. And unfortunately, it was not debated, but it has to be debated in the Polish left. The Gomułka era is much more important than the Gierek era. Even if in the Polish mind, the Gierek era left a lot of positive reminder, but in fact, the Gierek era is already an era where the question of socialism is vanishing. The basic question is the Gomułka era. It means Gomułka was one of the founders of the Polish Workers' Party that took the power in Poland in 1944. He was the leader of this party from 1944 to 1948. So to a large extent, the party was his creation. Of course, not only his individual creation, but he was one of the main founder of this party. And of course, then he was arrested for a short time, because in fact it was some years, couple of years, and then he went back to power for 14 years. So he in fact, People's Poland, it's more or less half of the time, and especially on its founding moment, it's Gomułka. So the question, who is Gomułka? Who is the people who were around Gomułka, where they come from, what is their ideology, what is their way of looking at strategy and tactic, is basic. And what I'm sad of is that when we talk about Poland now, and People's Poland, we are concentrating to two periods. The so-called Stalinist one, it means the period from 1949 to 1956, and the Gierek period. Of course, these two periods are very important. And of course, we have to talk about them and to analyze things and to have another point of view than the bourgeois one on these two periods. But still, there is something we don't really even manage to think about, is the Gomułka era. The Gomułka era is very important, and it was the less studied period, the less debated period. It's like if even the right wing or the left wing do not really manage what happened under Gomułka. And that's the basic point, because the base of People's Poland was Gomułka. He was one of the founder of the party. He was the leader of the party already under occupation. So you cannot think about PPR, it means the Polish Workers' Party, not taking into account the fact that the leader of this party was officially considering that the working class movement has to find a middle of the road way between the PPS tradition, the socialist, Polish socialist tradition, and the SDKPIL tradition, the social democrat, let's say, communist tradition. He was a middle of the road. He was always taking that on the national point of view, PPS socialists were right, and on the social point of view, SDKPIL communists were right. And we have to make the synthesis out of PPS and SDKPIL, and PPR is the synthesis of these two traditions. That's the basic ideology of Gomułka. Of course, we can agree or not with his ideology, but first of all, we have to take it into account and to accept that Gomułka line is this line. It's a middle of the road between PPS and SDKPIL, and it's not KPP. He was member of the KPP, of the Communist Party, of the pre-war Communist Party, but he was criticizing the national nihilism of KPP, of the party he was member of. And when he was in contact with Stalin, he was discussing about this national question. And Stalin, as you know, was a specialist of nationality question from before the revolution. So on this ways, they were they knew each other what they were talking about. They were not maybe having the same opinion, but they were all taking into consciousness the national question, and that's the basic difference with, let's say, Trotsky. Trotsky was a pure national nihilist. He didn't wanted to think about national question. Stalin was thinking about national question. Gomułka was thinking about national question. So they could have different point of view, but they knew that the one on the other side is aware of this question. And that's, for me, the reason why in Poland we didn't have the Gomułka trial as we had in Hungary, the Reich trial or Slansky trial in Czechoslovakia and so on. It's because of Stalin. Because in 1952, Stalin, we have documents now showing that Stalin was thinking that Berman is going too far in national nihilism of Polish situation. And it was, and that's why Światło, the Colonel Światło, which was from the security apparatus, went out in the Western world and choose to go to the American side, because he was observing that the policy in the Soviet direction was thinking that the Berman and the state security apparatus in Poland was too nihilist on national question, and that they
okay, but in your point of view, you said that Trotsky is a nihilist, Stalin is not a nihilist. Lenin, for you, he's where?
No, Lenin is, I would say Lenin is on the side of Stalin, objectively.
Yes, but when Lenin is said about that all nationalities who want to quit the Russia can quit the Russia.
Yeah, that's it. Lenin does not like, really, he does not like a national question. but he knows it's a very important question. And that's the reason why he didn't really study that question, and decided Stalin would be the man of national question, because he's the good man on this question. He wants to work on it. Let's him work on it, because he's a genius on that side. He's very clever. He understands those questions. I don't really like that question. Let Stalin work on it. And that's the very difference between Lenin and Trotsky, because Trotsky hates national question. Lenin don't like it. He would like a world Soviet Republic, but he knows that to go in that direction, you have to have some stage, and the national question is a real question, especially in colonial societies or in Russia, in the national minorities of the Russian empires, and this has to be taken into account. Because he doesn't really like it, because he's looking in the direction of future communism, he knows somebody has to do the job, and the best man to do the job is Stalin. And Stalin becomes very logically, very he worked a lot. I mean, Stalin, before the Russian Revolution, when he was in Galicia, when he was with Lenin, he began to go to the, to learn about nationality question, to read books about that question, to analyze the debate inside Austro-Marxism about nationality question in the Austrian Empire, and so on and so on. And of course, Stalin became the specialist of national question in the Bolshevik party. So Stalin knows very well what is knows better what is the national question than Lenin, but they are both on the same line. I mean, Lenin and Stalin wants the same thing. I mean, to go to communism and to make an internationalism out of a fragmented nation. But let's say Stalin is the specialist of this question, and Lenin is not the specialist of the question. And Trotsky is the nihilist, because Trotsky is the typical intellectual who is coming to socialism not because of working class, let's say, base, but because of idealism. He wants a new world without a nation, a united world, and a nationality for him is backyard. It has to be destroyed. And that begins with Trotsky, and that happens with Trotskyism now. Why the Trotskyists, for example, nowadays, they don't use the word internationalism. They prefer to use the word they invented, which is alter globalism. Because fundamentally they are globalists, but they are alter globalists. I mean, they are globalists on non-bourgeois lines, but they are globalists. Marxists, they are internationalists. They know that nations do exist, and these nations have to cooperate, but nations do exist. Trotsky is a national nihilist. He doesn't want nation to exist. For him, everything has to be melted. For Lenin, no. For Stalin, no. For Gomułka, of course, no, also. But, and then we can understand the difference between Stalin and Gomułka. That's tactical difference, because Stalin has still in mind the long-term strategy as the more important thing. And I think, but we have to study that, I think that Gomułka was much more, let's say, linked to the tactical questions and forgot about the strategical view. Not entirely forgot, but forgot for a large part of his policies. Stalin has always the long-term goals in the head, and tactical, he knows how to manage with tactic. But anyways, he knows it's tactic. Strategy, of course, is the internationalism on the world scale. He knows that there is something like world capitalism, and that to fight against world capitalism, you will have to have a world socialism. Gomułka is a Polish rooted man who is looking at the whole world from the Polish point of view. Stalin is looking at the whole world from a human point of view, and then he understands what means to be Russian, what means to be Georgian, what means to be Jew, what means to be Pole, what means to be, let's say, Kazakh or Tatar or whatever I want. But he knows that is from the human point of view. Gomułka is becoming from the Polish point of view. He became communist first as a Pole, not first as a worker, and that's basic difference. But of course, in the Gomułka case, we have to be much more intelligent. It means we have to study Gomułka era. Because what I tell you is what I wrote, what I read, and so on. But still, this period of time was not well studied by left, especially by left, Polish left. We talk about Bierut, Gierek, Bierut, Gierek, Bierut, Gierek. Of course, Bierut is important, very important, especially the 6-year plan. Is very important to understand the Polish economic reality. It's very important, but it's a short period. And the Gierek time is very important because it was the time where Poles were happy. Most of Poles were happy, and it's very good to be happy. I mean, why not? But the most important period of Gomułka, of People's Poland, are the Gomułka time. The Gomułka time from the war and post-war period, and the Gomułka time from the post 1956 period. That's also why Gomułka was one of the few leaders of the, let's say, pro-Soviet communist orientation after 1960 to refuse to condemn China. We have testimony of the translator of Gomułka who receives Walter Ulbricht, coming from East Berlin for a discussion. And Walter Ulbricht tells to Gomułka, let's launch in Poland a vast anti-China, anti-Mao Zedong campaign like we are doing all over the socialist country, the socialist European country, the Soviet, pro-Soviet socialist country. And Gomułka answers him, we cannot criticize too much Chinese comrades because they succeeded in what we didn't succeed. It's to make communism so popular that the last Chinese peasant is in favor of Communist Party. Which is not the situation we have in Eastern Europe, where a large part of our society do not like our party. So let's understand that Chinese comrades made a lot of error, but still they are much more successful than we are on the ideological side, and they do take into account the national independence question. We are not capable to take into account. It's more or less what Gomułka tells privately to Ulbricht.
Okay, I think that the biography of Gomułka we have to discuss another day. Because our discussion is now very long. I want to ask you last question. about what is your opinion about this situation on Baltic coast. Does we today we have to because there are two sides. There are
Yeah.
workers, and we support workers who struggle, and but there are party who want to build socialism, and we also support the parties who. So it's very difficult to say what have to be our position now that we are with the party or we are with the workers, and also what is the position of the Kazimierz Mijal and his comrades.
Kazimierz Mijal, about the 1970 riots, for his opinion, it's that the working class was rebelling about a new bourgeois class inside the Polish Workers' United Party. That's his position. Of course, I put it in one sentence. It can be developed, but more or less that's his position. On my point of view, he's strategically right, but maybe tactically not, because I think that the United Workers' Party in 1970 was a mix of different tendencies. And I would not say that Gomułka was a bourgeois leader. I think that Gomułka was, as I told you, a middle of the road, a realist, so-called realist, that still thought socialism is the good thing, but he didn't understand that very profoundly, that within socialism we have class struggle, and if we have class struggle in the socialism, we have class struggle inside the party. And he was criticizing the, let's say, opportunistic view of Gierek, but he was not understanding that as a class struggle inside the party, because Gierek was already something like a social democrat, but still a capitalist roader, because social democracy is capitalism. And he couldn't understand that. And that's why he was in the middle of the road. The workers that were rebelling against party, they had something like a pre-class awareness. They were understanding that a lot of party apparatus leaders were not really proletarian leaders, but they were newcomers in the working class, and they couldn't understand what is a real class struggle. And they looked at the party apparatus as a monster. They didn't understand that all the party is not on the other side, but there is a contradiction and on the inside the party, and that's also why they didn't organize, because logically, when you are protesting, the working class is always organizing strike and then eventually taking the street in an organized way. But what we had in Poland in 1970, it is more or less the state we had with working class at the beginning of 19th century in the Western world. It was the first working class movements were spontaneous movements, were objectively counter-revolutionary in a way, because they couldn't imagine a new system. They were just destroying machines in the working in factories, for example, because they didn't understand what is their real interest. And I think that the new Polish working class was at that level of consciousness in 1970. They were pre-worker working class consciousness. And what is worse, they were not in front of capitalists. They were in front of a party apparatus that was the theater of working of a class struggle inside the party. So they didn't understand that, and I think, and that's worse, that the Western elite the imperialist elite did understand that, and that's why they studied the 1970 riots as a lesson to organize counter-revolution within the new working class for the next decades. And they were much more prepared in 1980 to take over the working class, the new working class miscontent in favor of opportunism and then capitalism.
Okay, thank you, Bruno. It was a great speech, very interesting subject, but we have to continue. We have to continue other day because there are many other questions about Gomułka which I didn't ask today.
Okay. To the next time. Okay, so bye-bye.
Okay, see you. Bye.